Imagine you are Rome. You are the most powerful city on earth. Your legions have never been permanently defeated. Your walls have never been breached. Your empire is expanding on every side, and your confidence is absolute. Now imagine that one man, one general from a city you already defeated once, decides he is going to destroy you. Not with a bigger army, not with more resources, not with the support of a powerful nation behind him, just with his own mind. Just with tactics and intelligence and a level of military creativity that the ancient world had never seen before and has arguably never seen since. He crosses the Alps in winter with elephants. He enters Italy and defeats every army Rome sends against him. He kills more Roman soldiers in a single afternoon than Rome lost in entire wars. He camps in Italy for 16 years and Rome cannot remove him. And then he loses, not because anyone beat him, but because the world around him failed to match what was happening inside his head. His name was Hannibal Barca, and this is the greatest military story ever told. To understand Hannibal, you first need to understand Carthage, because Hannibal did not appear from nowhere. He was the product of a civilization, a family, and a burning generational hatred that was planted in him before he was old enough to fully understand what hatred meant. Carthage was a North African city-state based in what is now Tunisia, and for centuries it had been the dominant commercial and naval power of the Western Mediterranean. Carthaginian merchants traded across the entire known world. Carthaginian colonies dotted the coasts of Spain, Sardinia, Sicily, and North Africa. The city itself was wealthy beyond almost any comparison in the ancient world, a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people at its height. Rome and Carthage had been on a collision course for generations. Two expanding powers sharing the same sea was always going to produce conflict eventually. The First Punic War, which lasted from 264 to 241 BC, ended with Carthage defeated, stripped of Sicily, and forced to pay enormous war reparations to Rome. It was a humiliation that a proud civilization never forgot and never fully accepted. The Carthaginian general who felt that humiliation most personally was a man named Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal's father. Hamilcar was brilliant, undefeated in the field during the First Punic War, and absolutely consumed by hatred for Rome. He spent the years after the defeat rebuilding Carthaginian power in Spain, creating a new economic base that would eventually fund a second war. The story that ancient sources preserve about Hamilcar and his son is one of the most psychologically revealing moments in all of ancient history. When Hannibal was 9 years old, he begged his father to take him to Spain on campaign. Hamilcar agreed, but first he took the boy to the altar where sacrifices were made and asked him to swear an oath. Not the kind of oath a child swears carelessly. A formal, binding, religious oath in front of the gods. An oath that Hannibal would be an enemy of Rome for the rest of his life. Hannibal swore it. And he kept it. For the next 50 years, through victories and defeats, through exile and betrayal, and the ultimate destruction of everything he built, Hannibal Barca never stopped being an enemy of Rome. That childhood oath was not theater. It was the operating system of his entire existence. He was educated as a soldier from the earliest age. He studied Greek military texts, particularly the campaigns of Alexander the Great and the tactical innovations of the Macedonian phalanx. He was fluent in multiple languages: Phoenician, Greek, Latin, several Iberian dialects. He understood that war was not just about fighting. It was about logistics, intelligence, psychology, diplomacy, and the ability to read what your enemy was thinking before they thought it themselves. By the time he took command of the Carthaginian forces in Spain at the age of 26, following his father's death and his brother-in-law's assassination, he was arguably the most comprehensively prepared military commander the ancient world had ever produced. What came next was not an impulsive act of aggression. It was the execution of a plan that Hamilcar had dreamed of and Hannibal had spent his entire life preparing for. Rome was going to find out what it meant to have made an enemy of the Barca family. And the lesson was going to be delivered personally, on Italian soil, in a way that Rome would never fully recover from psychologically even after it ultimately survived. 218 BC. Hannibal makes the decision that will define his legend forever. He is going to invade Italy. Not by sea, which would require a naval superiority Carthage does not have after losing it in the First Punic War. He is going to go overland, through Spain, across southern France, over the Alps, and directly into the Italian peninsula from the north. A route that everyone in the ancient world considered essentially impossible for a large army. A route that no one had ever attempted with a force of this size. A route that would require crossing some of the highest and most dangerous mountain passes in Europe in late autumn, when conditions were already deteriorating toward winter. He started with approximately 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. By the time he reached the Alps, he had already lost significant forces to battles and desertions in Spain and southern France. The crossing itself took approximately 15 days of some of the most brutal conditions any ancient army ever endured. The passes were narrow, icy, and treacherous. Rockslides killed men and animals. Local alpine tribes attacked the column from above, rolling boulders down onto the marching soldiers. The elephants, which were terrifying in battle, were genuinely difficult to manage on narrow mountain paths above sheer drops. Men fell. Men froze. Men simply disappeared into the mountain. Hannibal arrived in northern Italy with approximately 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a reduced number of elephants. He had lost somewhere between a third and half of his entire force just getting to Italy. By any conventional military analysis, the campaign should have been over before it began. He was deep in enemy territory, massively outnumbered, with no supply lines back to Carthage, no naval support, and an army exhausted and depleted by weeks of mountain crossing in terrible conditions. What happened instead is one of the most extraordinary sequences in military history. Within weeks of arriving in Italy, Hannibal began winning. Not just winning, but winning so comprehensively, so one-sidedly, so repeatedly that Rome began to question whether its legions could face him in open battle at all. The reason was not numbers. The reason was Hannibal's mind. He understood Roman tactics with a precision that the Romans did not understand themselves. He knew how the Roman legions were trained to fight, how they responded to pressure, where their formations were vulnerable, how their commanders thought. He used that knowledge the way a chess grandmaster uses knowledge of openings, not just reacting to what his opponent did, but creating situations where his opponent had no good options regardless of what they chose. Every battle was a trap. Every Roman advance led somewhere Hannibal had already decided he wanted them to go. Fighting Hannibal was not like fighting a better army. It was like fighting someone who had already seen the future and arranged the present accordingly. Rome sent its best generals. Rome sent its largest armies. And Hannibal destroyed them, one after another, in ways that became increasingly humiliating and increasingly terrifying for the most powerful city on earth. 216 BC. 2 years after crossing the Alps, Hannibal has already defeated Rome at the Trebia River and Lake Trasimene. The Roman losses have been severe, tens of thousands of soldiers dead, multiple consuls humiliated. Rome is rattled in a way it has not been since the Gauls sacked the city 2 centuries earlier. The Roman Senate responds by assembling the largest army in Roman history to that point. 8 Roman legions plus allied forces. Somewhere between 70,000 and 86,000 soldiers, depending on which ancient source you trust. The plan is simple and overwhelming. Find Hannibal, surround him with sheer numbers, and crush him through pure mass. They find him near the town of Cannae in southeastern Italy. And what happens there on the 2nd of August 216 BC is something that military academies around the world still study today. Not just as ancient history, but as a live tactical lesson. Cannae is considered by military historians to be the most perfectly executed battle in human history. 2,200 years later, generals were still trying to replicate what Hannibal did that afternoon. Hannibal had approximately 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry against Rome's 70,000 plus infantry and 6,000 cavalry. He was outnumbered nearly 2 to 1 in the arm that Roman commanders considered decisive, the infantry. Any conventional commander looking at those numbers would have chosen defensive ground, tried to neutralize Rome's numerical advantage through terrain, avoided the kind of open field engagement where numbers matter most. Hannibal chose completely open ground, flat, featureless, perfect for the kind of large formation battle where Rome's superior numbers should have been overwhelming. Every Roman commander present thought he had made a fatal mistake. They were wrong in a way that would cost them between 50,000 and 70,000 men before sunset. The formation Hannibal chose was what military historians now call a double envelopment or pincer movement, but executed with a sophistication that had never been attempted before on this scale. He placed his weakest troops, Gallic and Spanish infantry, in the center of his line, bulging forward toward the Romans. On the flanks, he placed his strongest African infantry, veterans hardened by years of campaigning. And on the cavalry wings, he placed his Numidian and Spanish horsemen. When the battle began, the Roman mass pushed forward into Hannibal's center exactly as he anticipated. The Gallic and Spanish infantry in the center began to bend backward under Roman pressure, retreating slowly, drawing the Roman formation forward and inward. The Romans pushed harder, sensing victory, packing themselves more densely into what they saw as a collapsing enemy center. What they were actually doing was walking into a closing fist. As the Roman infantry packed tighter and tighter in pursuit of the retreating center, Hannibal's African veterans on both flanks pivoted inward. They were now attacking the sides of the Roman formation. Simultaneously, Hannibal's cavalry had routed Rome's horsemen on both wings and swung around to attack the Roman rear. Within hours, the entire Roman army, 70,000 men, was completely surrounded, encircled on every side by a numerically inferior force. The Romans could not swing their weapons without hitting their own men. They could not form defensive lines because there was no direction that was not already an enemy direction. The slaughter that followed lasted most of the afternoon. Ancient sources record between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans killed in a single day. Among the dead were 80 Roman senators, a significant fraction of Rome's entire governing class. 2 Roman consuls were present. One died in the battle. One escaped with a handful of survivors. It was the single worst military disaster in Roman history, possibly the worst single day of casualties any Western army suffered until the First World War. When the news reached Rome, the city fell into a collective shock that ancient sources describe as unlike anything seen before or since. Women were not allowed to leave their houses to wail publicly because the Senate feared mass panic. Emergency measures were enacted. Sacred objects were buried under the forum to prevent them from being captured. Human sacrifices, extremely rare in Roman practice, were made to the gods. For a brief period, serious people in Rome genuinely discussed whether the city could survive. Hannibal had not just won a battle. He had broken something inside Rome's confidence that would take years to fully rebuild. And he was not finished. After Cannae, Hannibal stood at the gates of history. He had done what no one thought possible. He had brought the most powerful military machine on earth to its knees on its own soil. His cavalry commander Hannibal famously told him after the battle that if he marched on Rome immediately, he could eat dinner on the capital within 5 days. Hannibal did not march on Rome, and that decision has been debated by military historians for over 2,000 years. Why did he not march? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. Ancient sources give several explanations. He lacked siege equipment to breach Rome's walls. His army needed rest and resupply after the battle. He believed, incorrectly as it turned out, that Rome's Italian allies would defect to him after such a catastrophic defeat, isolating Rome politically and making a siege unnecessary. He may have hoped that Rome, faced with the reality of Cannae, would negotiate terms that would give Carthage what it wanted without requiring the complete destruction of the city. Whatever his reasoning, the decision not to march on Rome immediately after Cannae was the hinge point of the entire war. Because Rome did something that almost no ancient city-state had ever done in the same situation. It refused to negotiate. The Senate passed a resolution that no Roman would discuss peace terms while a foreign army was on Italian soil. They scraped together every available man. Slaves were freed and armed. Criminals were released from prison and given weapons. The minimum age for military service was lowered. Rome rebuilt its armies and changed its strategy completely. The new Roman approach was designed specifically to counter Hannibal's genius. Stop fighting him in open battle where his tactical brilliance was decisive. Instead, cut off his supplies, attack his smaller foraging parties, besiege the Italian cities that had defected to him, and simply wait. The strategy was humiliating for Rome. It meant watching Hannibal march around Italy essentially unopposed for years. But it worked because it removed the battlefield, the one domain where Hannibal was genuinely unbeatable. Hannibal's deeper problem was Carthage itself. He had gone to Italy expecting his government to send him reinforcements, supplies, siege equipment, money. They sent almost nothing. The faction that controlled Carthaginian politics during the war was actually hostile to the Barca family and was content to let Hannibal fight his war with whatever he had taken over the Alps. Every request for significant reinforcement was delayed, reduced, or denied. He was fighting the greatest war of the ancient world essentially alone, with a shrinking army, no siege capability, and a home government that was more interested in protecting its Spanish silver mines than winning the war he was fighting on their behalf. He stayed in Italy for 16 years. 16 years without a single significant defeat in the field. 16 years of tactical brilliance in a strategic situation that was slowly strangling him. And then Rome took the war to Africa, and everything changed. 202 BC. A young Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio has done what everyone said was impossible. He has taken the war to Africa. He landed in North Africa with a Roman army, won battles against Carthaginian forces, and is now threatening Carthage itself. Hannibal, after 16 years in Italy, is finally recalled home to defend the city he left as a young man burning with his father's oath. Scipio was 34 years old. He was the most talented Roman commander of his generation and arguably the most talented Rome ever produced. He had studied Hannibal's tactics obsessively, the way a young athlete studies the greatest player in history. He had specifically trained his cavalry to counter the Numidian horsemen who had been decisive at Cannae and every other Hannibalic victory. He had recruited Numidian cavalry of his own under a brilliant African king named Massinissa. He had built a Roman army specifically designed to fight Hannibal and neutralize every advantage that had made Hannibal unbeatable for 16 years. The two generals met before the Battle of Zama and actually spoke, face to face. The greatest general of the ancient world and the man who had studied him his entire career. Ancient sources preserve what they said to each other, though how accurate these accounts are after 2 millennia is impossible to verify. What is certain is that no agreement was reached, and they returned to their respective armies to fight. Zama was the one battle of his career that Hannibal lost. His elephant charge, which had broken so many formations before, was neutralized when Scipio ordered his infantry to open lanes in the formation and let the elephants run through without impact. His infantry fought hard, but were eventually outmatched. And then the Numidian cavalry that had been decisive at Cannae was not on his side this time. It was Scipio's. When it hit the Carthaginian rear, the battle was finished. Hannibal escaped. He went to Carthage, participated briefly in politics, then went into exile rather than be handed over to Rome. He spent his final years moving from court to court across the eastern Mediterranean, advising the king of Syria, advising the king of Bithynia, always staying one step ahead of Roman demands for his extradition. He won more battles in exile, helping smaller kingdoms fight Rome's allies, still brilliant, still dangerous, still keeping his oath. When Roman agents finally cornered him in Bithynia, and it was clear there was no escape, Hannibal took poison he had kept ready for exactly this moment. His reported last words were variations on the same bitter observation. Let us relieve the Romans of their long anxiety, since they find it too long to wait for the death of an old man. He was approximately 64 or 67 years old. He died undefeated in battle. He died having never broken his oath. He died as the one man Rome was genuinely afraid of for his entire adult life. What do you do with a story like Hannibal's? How do you categorize a man who was by almost every measure the greatest military mind in human history and lost? He crossed the Alps when everyone said it was impossible. He defeated Rome 3 times in 2 years with an army outnumbered at every engagement. He invented tactical concepts that military academies teach as foundational principles 2,000 years later. He stayed undefeated in the field for 16 years on enemy soil with no meaningful support from his own government. He did everything right, and Rome survived anyway. The lesson of Hannibal is not about tactics. It is not about courage or brilliance or preparation or creativity. Hannibal had all of those things in quantities that may never have been matched in human history. The lesson of Hannibal is about systems. Rome survived not because it had better generals, it did not. Rome survived because it had a system, a political system that refused to quit, a social system that could absorb catastrophic losses and keep producing soldiers, an institutional memory that could change strategy mid-war and implement that change consistently across decades. Hannibal was a single man, however extraordinary. Rome was a machine, and that is perhaps the most American lesson in all of ancient history. Individual genius matters, but it is never enough alone. The system you build around you, the institutions that support or fail you, the people who share your vision or abandon it, these things determine outcomes more than talent ever can. Hannibal was the greatest. Rome was greater. And the difference was never about the battlefield.